So good morning to you all. I'm Sarah Mokadem, and I'm International Relations Specialist at the Policy Center for the New South. Before we begin today, please allow me to thank the Moroccan Observatory on Extremism and Violence, and also its president, Dr. Mustafa Razrazi, who is also Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, for organizing this three-day conference to address and discuss the new challenges to countering violent extremism and to identify potential strategies. Maybe we will just finish yesterday's discussion, because unfortunately we did not have with us two speakers yesterday who are joining today just to contribute to this discussion. So I'm not sure, maybe Mr. Thomas Wuch is already online. I would like to discuss doctrine mutation and a new form of narrative, extremism narrative and hate speech. So Mr. Thomas, if you're with us, please, the floor is yours. And also Mrs. Jennifer Santiago Oreta, who is also discussing disengagement, deradicalization, and rehabilitation. Please, Mrs. Jennifer, you may start, and we will wait for Mr. Thomas to join later on. Hear you here. If you could maybe just unmute yourself. No, she can't hear us, maybe. Maybe if you could just give us 1 second, we will just verify exactly what is the issue with the sound and get back to you very shortly. But if you could also please on your side, make sure that your microphone is connected and that you're online on Zoom, activating your audio settings so that you can have access to the microphone. We'll take just 30 seconds just to try again. If not, we will move on with today's session. Thank you.
We can't hear you yet. Can you please mute your mic? Can you open it? Sorry. I guess your mic is closed, deactivated. Can you activate your mic from your own PC? Or maybe you log out and log on once again. Maybe it can be better.
Okay, and Mr. Thomas, also maybe if you're already with us on Zoom, please don't hesitate to eventually take the lead if your microphone is also is working, and we can start with your presentation. So. Mm-hmm. I'm very sorry, Mrs. Jennifer, but we're still unable to hear you. It's probably due to the audio setting. Maybe you could try to disconnect and log on again to the Zoom session, making sure that your audio is activated. Okay. Okay. So maybe if you could bear with us and make some tests on your side. We're very sorry, and we thank you again for joining this discussion this morning. And we really look forward to having your contribution to this discussion. So we will start today's session. Meanwhile, I would invite you to maybe make some tests for your audio, and we will try at the end of this session to see if we can connect with you, Mrs. Jennifer. Thank you again, and we'll get back to you after the end of this session. Thank you for holding with us. So today's discussion is about women and violent extremism. Through the past years, violent extremist activities have escalated dramatically, and the role of women extends beyond being just victims or perpetrators. In fact, a number of UN Security Council resolutions have recognized the gender dimensions when addressing violent extremism. In fact, last year, for instance, marked the 20th anniversary for the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, recognizing for the first time the impact of armed conflicts on women and girls, but most importantly, also reaffirming the central role of women in conflict prevention, management, and resolution. Hence, beside the structural gender inequalities that can exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and feed the root causes of violent extremism, the role of women in preventing and countering violent extremism is increasingly coming under the spotlight. So to understand the challenges in addressing gender dimensions in violent extremism, I'm very delighted to have with me today and with us today 7 leading female researchers on the role of women in violent extremism. So today we have with us Mrs. Dalal Mahmoud El-Sayed Mahmoud, who is Director of the Security and Defense Program at the Egyptian Center for Strategic Studies. And we have also with us 5 researchers from the Moroccan Observatory on Extremism and Violence, namely Mrs. Selwa Soumati, Mrs. Maha Ghazi, Mrs. Yasmin El-Abdslami, Mrs. Salma Abiru, and Mrs. Mhani Ashur. So without further ado, please, Mrs. Dalal, the floor is yours.
صباح الخير على حضراتكم جميعا. أرجو أن يكون الصوت واضح. في البداية الحقيقة في البداية أود أن أنا يعني أتوجه بالشكر لحضراتكم كل القائمين والمنظمين للمؤتمر بداية على دعوتي وعلى اختيار الموضوع. يعني فكرة البحث عن أجوبة جديدة ده شيء مهم جدا في ظل ظروف استثنائية كلنا نعيشها في المرحلة الحالية. والحقيقة انطلاقا من فكرة المحفل العلمي اللي أنا شرفت إن أنا أتابع بعض جلساته خلال اليومين السابقين، فيعني اسمحوا لي إن أنا أعمل مداخلة على المرأة والتطرف العنيف وإزاي نبحث عن أجوبة جديدة لهذه القضية. في البداية يعني أنا حابة أؤكد على شيء حضراتكم تعرفونه جميعا، لكن محتاج إن أنا أكد عليه تاني، إن التطرف العنيف في حد ذاته هو عملية ديناميكية تبدأ من فكرة تقبل العنف وتنتهي بممارسته فعلا بشكل مباشر أو بشكل غير مباشر. وده الحقيقة بيدفعني للتساؤل، طيب أين تولد وتنتشر هذه الأفكار المتطرفة؟ طبعا حضراتكم أكيد خبراء في هذا الموضوع، لكن اسمحوا لي إن أنا بالإضافة للفئات التقليدية اللي هي بتكون يعني بتزرع فيها الأفكار المتطرفة زي الجماعات الإرهابية والمجتمعات اللي مليئة بالصراعات والنزاعات، لكن هناك بؤر جديدة يجب أن ننتبه إليها في هذه المرحلة. يمكن أنا يعني هشاور مع حضراتكم على 3 أو 4 يعني بؤر جديدة تتولد فيها الأفكار المتطرفة وتسمح بتقبل العنف. بدايتها المخيمات، مخيمات النازحين اللي هي الحقيقة موجودة في المنطقة عندنا، واللي بيها أعداد من النساء ومن الأطفال يصعب إن الواحد يحصرها بشكل دقيق. يمكن في بعض التقديرات تجاوزت 70,000، يمكن في تقديرات تانية الأرقام متفاوتة الحقيقة. أنا أعلم إن هذه المخيمات هي نتيجة صراعات، لكن هذه المخيمات في حد ذاتها أصبحت بؤر للتطرف. السيدات هم فيها يعني الفاعل الأكبر الأكثر حضوراً، إما بكونهم سيدات أو لأنهم أمهات لأطفال ولدوا ويتم تنشئتهم في هذه المخيمات. فهؤلاء الأمهات إما إنهم مارسوا العنف فعلاً أو يتعرضون لضغوط وظروف سيئة صحية وأمنية وأسرية وكل حاجة تدفعهم لتقبل العنف. ويمكن في دراسات كتيرة جدا اتكلمت على أن السيدات يمارسن العنف بقوة، وأن هناك سيطرة للفكر المتطرف داخل هذه المخيمات. فإحنا بنتكلم على أطفال هيخرجوا يبقوا بالفعل هم قنابل أو فاعلين للتطرف. البؤرة التانية أو المسرح التاني لنشر الأفكار المتطرفة هي في المجتمعات يمكن المتقدمة شوية، اللي فيها يعني عودة لفكرة اليمين المتطرف أو اليسار المتطرف. تقبل أصلا إن يبقى إحنا بنتكلم على أفكار إكستريم حتى لو هي أفكار سياسية، معناها أن صاحبها قد يستخدم العنف أو هو مؤهل ليحمل السلاح لنشر هذه الأفكار. ويمكن إحنا شفنا مشهد في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية في 6 يناير الماضي لما حصلت أحداث اقتحام الكونجرس، ولم تكن السيدات غائبات عن هذا. فتقبل استخدام العنف لفرض واقع معين أو يعني دعم فكرة معينة، أظن إن ده برضو تطور يجب إن إحنا ننتبه ليه. المحفل الثالث يمكن لنشر الأفكار المتطرفة، وأنا هنا بوسع الفيجن بتاعت الأفكار المتطرفة ولا أقصرها على الجانب الديني اللي هي بتعتمد عليه الجماعات الإرهابية. أنا بتكلم على وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي. يعني عدم خضوعها لرقابة أسرية هي ساحة بالفعل لاستقطاب العديد والعديد من يمكن من الأفراد حتى لو فيهم كبار، لكن الشريحة الأكبر هي الشباب. غرز فكرة أن يكون هناك أفكار يجب فرضها أو أن ما يتبناه الفرد هو الفكر الصحيح، ده بداية التطرف ويشهد أو يحمل مؤشر خطر لفكرة تقبل العنف فيما بعد. وإحنا هنا بنتكلم بقى على يعني إزاي نبحث عن أجوبة جديدة. أنا من وجهة نظري يعني أحب أشارك حضراتكم فيها، لابد أن يعني نأخذ في الأمر اعتبارين. الاعتبار الأولاني إن أي محاولة لمكافحة أو منع التطرف العنيف لابد أن تكون مقاربة شاملة، رؤية شاملة، سواء داخل الدولة بتعامل ما بين أجهزة الدولة والمجتمع المدني، مواجهة خارجية شاملة لأن التطرف أصبح عابر للحدود، وبالتالي لابد أن تكون المواجهة أيضا عابرة للحدود. النقطة الثانية إن إحنا هنا عايزين نميز ما بين إن أنا وأنا بواجه التطرف العنيف في مرحلتين، مرحلة مكافحة التطرف العنيف أو الوقاية من انتشار التطرف العنيف، والمرحلة الثانية هي مرحلة منع التطرف العنيف أو إنفاذ القانون في هذا المنع. دور المرأة مهم في المرحلتين، لكن الحقيقة أنا شايفة إن دورها الأكبر في مرحلة الوقاية. ربما يكون في مرحلة المنع وإنفاذ القانون في أجهزة معينة يجب أن تشارك فيها المرأة، نعم، لكن هناك أجهزة إنفاذ القانون. لكن دور المرأة في مرحلة سن التشريع والانخراط في المجتمع والتعامل مع المجتمع بشكل مباشر، خاصة في المجتمعات الشرقية أو المجتمعات المحافظة المحلية، يكون حركة المرأة أكثر سهولة ومرونة. لأن إحنا مثلا يصعب على رجل غريب أن يدخل بيوت فيها سيدات، لكن المرأة يمكنها الدخول والتعامل مع السيدات بشكل أكثر مرونة. وهنا أنا يعني حتى لا أطيل على حضراتكم، يعني أنا حابة أشير إلى بعض التوصيات أو المقترحات اللي ممكن يعني تكون محل نقاش مع حضراتكم بإذن الله. منها أو أولها توظيف الأمهات. يعني هناك تشابه الأمهات أيضا ظاهرة عابرة الحدود. ماذا لو دربنا الأمهات على رصد بوادر ومؤشرات التطرف واتجاهه إلى العنف بين الأبناء؟ يعني كثير من الأمهات لا تعي هذه المؤشرات في بدايتها، بالتالي أنا بقترح أن يكون في جزء من نشاط المراكز المهتمة مع حضراتكم زي حضراتكم أو زي يعني العديد من المنظمات والوكالات المهتمة بهذه الظاهرة، أن تسهم في يعني إنشاء مراكز لتدريب الأمهات. وأنا أعي الأمهات يعني اللي هم بالفعل أمهات أو أمهات المستقبل، لكن لأن في رابطة يعني القوة العاطفية عند المرأة يمكن أن تساعدها في إدراك أو ملاحظة عدد من المؤشرات يمكن مش هيلاحظها أكتر خبير أو أكتر تربوي بشكل عام. الحاجة التانية إن في يعني يا ريت إن إحنا يكون في مجتمعاتنا دعوة لتعزيز فكرة الشرطة المجتمعية، يعني توسيع دور الأجهزة الأمنية الشرطية حتى ما تكونش وظيفتها هي إنفاذ القانون بس، لكن هي ضبط المجتمع، وجزء من ضبط المجتمع التعامل بفاعلية وإيجابية مع منظمات المجتمع المدني. وانخراط الشرطة المجتمعية هيجعل هذا الأمر أكثر سهولة وأكثر يسرا في كثير من الأحيان. برضو يعني يمكن أنا حابة أكد على فكرة قيلت كثيرا لكني شايفاها مهمة في مرحلة الوقاية، هي تمكين المرأة اقتصاديا أو إتاحة الفرصة ليها لاستقلال مادي. يعني جزء من يعني السيدات اللي تم اعتقالهم في يعني جماعات متطرفة كانت السبب أنها تابعة للزوج، وهذا أمر يعني أظن إن هو يعني له وجهته، لكن الفكرة إنه يجب البحث عن بدائل للمرأة للعيش. فكرة يعني أو يعني أحد الأمور الأخرى فكرة يعني تنويع وتجديد شكل العقوبات التي يمكن أن تفرض، تشديد العقوبات على الجرائم الصريحة للعنف ضد المرأة أو لنشر أفكار متطرفة، لكن أيضا يمكن البحث عن أفكار بديلة. يعني إذا ثبت، لماذا لا نبحث في تشريع يكون ثبت ضلوع المرأة المتطرفة يكون مهددة بأن يتم أخذ أولادها ودفعهم لأسر بديلة، لأن أنا في سبيل أن أنا أحد انتشار الأفكار المتطرفة يجب أن أقي هؤلاء الأبناء من أفكار متطرفة قد تزرعها أمهاتهم. ففكرة الأسر البديلة للأطفال خاصة حديث السن ربما تكون نهج غير تقليدي شوية، طبعا بالإضافة بقى لبرامج التأهيل والدمج، لكن يصعب التعميم فيها الحقيقة، لأن مش هقدر يعني أوسع أو أطبق برنامج لإعادة التأهيل أو دمج هؤلاء السيدات أو اللي بيحملوا أفكار متطرفة أو ممكن يساعدوا فيها بنفس القدر. لابد أن يكون هناك فحص نفسي مختلف لكل حالة على حدة. وأخيرا فكرة الهوية الشخصية، يعني جزء كبير من الثقافة المجتمعية عندنا أن المرأة قد لا تشعر بأن لها هوية شخصية مستقلة، بل تتخذ هويتها من مجتمعها الضيق بقى، سواء الأسرة أو الزوج، القبيلة، العيلة. فالهوية الشخصية هنا، ودي فكرة لو تم تعزيزها عند الفتيات من صغر السن، ربما تكون انقيادهم لأفكار مختلفة أو بحثهم عن مساحة لدور مؤثر يكون يعني أقل حضورا. في النهاية يعني أنا يعني بشكر لحضراتكم إن أنتوا أتحتوا لي الفرصة للمشاركة، ويعني أنا في انتظار مناقشات وتعقيبات حضراتكم. شكرا.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Dalal, for your contribution. You have, in fact, discussed the pull and push factors that make women join and engage with violent extremist groups. And this goes from the acceptance of violence, as you said, to the practice of violence, either directly or indirectly. You have cited some of the relevant factors, such as social grievances that may be due to health security issues or gender discriminations within societies that need to be addressed. And also you have mentioned the role of social network in not only spreading, but also in indoctrinating and also recruiting young ladies to join violent extremist groups. You have also insisted on addressing violent extremism through a holistic approach that takes into consideration the gender dimensions in empowering women, and also in preventing and protecting, especially children, in environments that can represent breeding grounds for violent thoughts. And you have also highlighted the importance of sensitizing women about violent extremism and extremist discourse by involving women in this program of prevention and countering extremism. So thank you again for your presentation. And I would like to, before we move to our presenters and researchers from the Moroccan Observatory of Extremism and Violence, I would like to maybe give Dr. Zrazi a couple of minutes to introduce the project of the observatory and the mission of this institute. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm not introducing the observatory, but I would like to introduce this project of those brilliant young researcher working on women. And this project started almost 2 years ago. And we expect that we will have the publication by May or June, inshallah. So basically, the project includes different aspects, legal aspects, social, psychological aspects related to the victimology and women as a victim, and also debating either the woman who was in zone of tensions, how can we deal with it, which means even the operational aspect was highlighted in this study. Other parts are related also to what type of fatwa was used to recruit women in our region, talking about our region, specifically the Maghreb, North Africa, and more specifically in Morocco. We have identified at least 12 sources that have targeted Moroccan women, and in terms of recruitments, we have, well, not basically all Moroccans, the producers of the fatwa. We have Yusuf bin Salah al-Ayiri, we have Omar al-Hazimi, we have Turki bin Ali, or his other name, Abu Hammam al-Athari. We have Abu Munder Shankiti, Muhammad al-Arifi, Abu Muslim al-Jazairi, أبو سعد العاملي، أبو جعفر الخطاب التونسي، أبو عبد القهار الحسني الجزائري، أبو بكر الأثري, and Al-Marzuqi Ajha from Morocco. So this chapter also was quite interesting because it has to do with something was discussed yesterday, which is that we have a tendency of the localization of how we say, the trends of terrorist groups in our region. It's no more this referencing related to the East or to the Gulf countries or to the original doctrine coming from Al-Qaeda. So we are facing today, even in the Sahel, we have seen yesterday the discussion that even in the Sahel, there is the appropriation of all, elements to build up own local terrorism. So even in our region, in terms of violent extremism, we are facing the same phenomena. So I will not take more time. Maybe we will plan to have another session within next 2 months on this issue. And I get back to the chairperson for giving the floor to our young researchers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Drazi, for presenting this project. And in fact, I think what you have now showed us with the 12 sources that you have cited so far targeting Moroccan women in their discourse and in their extremist speech also. I think the discourse is getting more localized and it does take into account local realities, which makes probably the discourse and the speech more difficult to deconstruct, I guess.
Mr. Fernando Vienna is here. He wasn't able to talk yesterday, so 10 minutes.
Okay. So I think I'll give the floor to Salwa and Salwa Soumati for her presentation. Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين. سعيدة بتواجدي معكم أيها الحضور الكريم، وأتقدم بجزيل الشكر للمرصد المغربي حول التطرف والعنف، وأخص بالذكر الدكتور مصطفى الدرازي. مداخلتي ستكون حول موضوع النساء والوقاية من التطرف والعنف. أثبت الواقع للعب النساء لمجموعة من الأدوار النشطة داخل التنظيمات الإرهابية وظهورهن في صور بشعة، حيث اتخذ انخراطهن في أعمال العنف المتطرف أشكال جد معقدة، بما في ذلك كقائمات على التجنيد، الاستقطاب، وبعض الأحيان القيام ببعض العمليات الانفجارية، مما أدى بالمنتظم الدولي والمحلي إلى تبني سياسات للقضاء على هذه الظاهرة مع ضرورة إشراك النساء في ذلك. يتمثل تفعيل مشاركة النساء في التصدي لكافة أشكال التطرف العنيف تنفيذ قرار مجلس الأمن رقم 1325 والمتعلق بالمرأة والأمن والسلم. ينص القرار على أن عملية السلم مرتبطة أساساً بالمساواة بين الجنسين، وأن قيادة المرأة تظل خطوة جوهرية في مسار منع النزاعات وإرسال السلم والأمن. والوقاية بشكل عام تهدف إلى معالجة الظروف المؤدية للتطرف ثم معالجة التطرف المؤدي للعنف. والوقاية ليست إجراء وقتي محدد في الزمان والمكان، بل هي تبتدئ منذ مرحلة مبكرة. فالمرأة اليوم هي طفلة الأمس، ووقايتها من التطرف تبدأ من نوع التربية المتلقى داخل الأسرة وعدم تمييزها عن شقيقها الذكر، نوع التعليم الذي تتلقاه في المدرسة، تثقيفها الديني، ظروف اندماجها في المجتمع، مشاركتها في الجمعيات والأنشطة السياسية، ولوجها في سوق الشغل، وتمكينها اقتصاديا لتوفير لقمة العيش. وعموما يمكننا أن نقسم الوقاية منهجيا إلى نوعين: وقاية قبلية ووقاية بعدية، حيث يمكن اعتبار أن الوقاية القبلية هي مجموع الإجراءات المعمول بها قبل تحول الأفراد إلى متطرفين، ويتم ذلك عبر تحديد العوامل التي تدفع الفرد إلى التحول إلى متطرف. وهنا أشير أن الدوافع التي تجعل الرجال يتحولون إلى متطرفين ليست هي نفس العوامل التي تدفع المرأة للتحول، فغالبا الرجل يثيره الدافع المالي الغرائزي في حين أن المرأة تتحول بدافع الإيمان والبحث عن الهوية المشتركة، الانتقام في بعض الأحيان حالة الأرامل السود، والقرابة للالتحاق بالزوجة والأخ، وهو دافع معظم النساء المغربيات. ولكن بصفة عامة يمكننا أن نلخص هذه العوامل في العوامل الاجتماعية الاقتصادية النفسية الفردية كالتهميش ومحدودية الفرص من التعليم والعمل والشعور بالإحساس أنها الضحية، العوامل السياسية كانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان، الإحساس بالظلم والعزلة وعدم تكافؤ الفرص وضعف المشاركة السياسية، ثم العوامل الدينية كعدم فهم للنصوص الدينية. من خلال رصد الدوافع يمكننا استنتاج الآليات التي تعطي إجراءات الوقاية والمرتبطة أساساً بالنساء. في المغرب يمكننا استنتاج بعض الإجراءات أو العوامل المحتملة التي يمكنها أن تقينا من التطرف، ونجد مؤسسة الأسرة وخاصة لدور الأم على اعتبارها حاضنة الأسرة وقوامها القادرة على إصلاح أخطاء المجتمع بداية من بيتها انطلاقا من تربية الأبناء وفق المنظور الصحيح وتأطيرهم فكريا والحفاظ على تماسك الأسرة. بالطبع الأم لا تسيطر على كافة المدخلات الفكرية والإيديولوجية التي يتعرض لها الأبناء خارج البيت، ولكنها حلقة مهمة جدا لأنها تتفاعل مع الأبناء بشكل مستمر وتستطيع أن تلمح أي تغيير في سلوكهم. ولكي يكون للأسرة دور فعال في الوقاية من التطرف يجب رد الاعتبار للأسرة من أجل استعادة دورها في تربية الأبناء على القيم المشتركة والتعاليم الدينية المعتدلة. وفي هذا الإطار هناك برنامج وضعته وزارة التضامن والتنمية الاجتماعية والمساواة، برنامج يسمى التربية الوالدية. ومن ضمن الأدوات أيضاً التي تدخل في الوقاية القبلية في المغرب هناك إعادة تشكيل المؤسسات والشؤون الدينية لتواكب المتغيرات التي يعرفها السياق الدولي والوطني من تحولات فكرية اجتماعية اقتصادية وثقافية. ومن الجوانب الرئيسية التي أثارها المغرب لهذا الإصلاح تم إطلاق محطات تلفزيونية وإذاعية هدفها موازنة تأثير الدعاة المتشددين، تدريب وتثقيف العاملين في المجال الديني بما في ذلك الأئمة الواعظين والواعظات المعروفين باسم المرشدين والمرشدات. وفي هذا السياق نجد تجربة المرشدات الدينيات اللواتي يقمن بأعمال وعظ وإرشاد ديني في المجالس والمحاضرات وإلقاء دروس محو الأمية عبر التعليم والكتابة في المساجد وشرح وسطية الإسلام واعتداله اعتمادا على لغة الحوار وتبسيط الأفكار ومناقشتها وتوضيح خطورة التطرف المفضي للعنف. حسب رأيي أن هذا الإجراء سيتم جراء تشبيك وانفتاح المغرب على الدول الإفريقية، سيساهم في عملية التشبيك بين الدول الإفريقية من أجل تكوين رؤية موحدة لمكافحة التطرف. إضافة إلى ذلك هناك العديد من الإجراءات التي نهجها المغرب في صدد ذلك كاستراتيجية التعليم الغير نظامي لتمكين النساء اللواتي لم يتمدرسن في الصغر من التعليم داخل المساجد وتثقيفهن على المستوى الديني، حرية الرأي والتعبير، وجود منظومة قانونية تعمل على تحيين القوانين المنظمة لحياة المرأة، تعديل مدونة الأسرة لتمكين المرأة من حقوقها. ألخص القول أن تمكين المرأة من التمدرس، تمكينها من الشغل، من التعبير، وتوفير لها ظروف معيشية جيدة سواء داخل الأسرة مع والديها أو مع الزوج له بوادر لإحساس المرأة بمكانتها داخل المجتمع ولن تبحث عنها داخل تنظيمات أخرى. أما النوع الثاني من الوقاية البعدية والذي يتم بعد تحول النساء إلى متطرفات، وذلك لحمايتهن من حالة العود وتجنب تأثير هؤلاء النسوة على المحيط. تشمل حالات النساء العائدات من بؤر التوتر والنساء اللواتي لهن سوابق قضائية تحت خلفية الإرهاب. تشكل حالات النساء العائدات من بؤر التوتر خطراً على اعتبار أنهم محملين بأفكار التكفير والكراهية ضد المجتمعات التي عاشوا فيها قبل الانضمام للتنظيم، مع احتمالية قيامهن بتجنيد مقاتلين جدد في صفوف التنظيم، ما يفتح الباب لتنفيذ عملية إرهابية جديدة. إن التعامل مع هذه الفئة يستوجب من الضروري إيجاد برامج خاصة تتضمن إخضاع كل النساء وأطفالهن لعملية تقييم شاملة على المستوى الفردي تحدد الأهلية النفسية والاجتماعية وتحديد المتطلبات الفردية والعمل على إعداد برنامج تأهيل تتناسب مع كل حالة، بما في ذلك إذا كنا من مناطق حضرية أو قروية، وما إذا كنا متزوجات أو عادوا بأطفال، علاوة على مستوى التعليم. تؤثر هذه التفاصيل الدقيقة في إدماج المرأة داخل المجتمع. وأحيط بالذكر هنا أن عدد النساء المغربيات العائدات من بؤر التوتر 99 امرأة مقابل 288 الذين غادروا في اتجاه أرض الخلافة. في سياق الوقاية البعدية، أطلق المغرب برنامج مصالحة لتأهيل المعتقلين في قضايا الإرهاب تمهيداً لإعادة إدماجهم بالمجتمع، والقائم على 3 نقاط رئيسية: مصالحتهم مع الذات، مصالحتهم مع المجتمع، والمصالحة مع النص الديني. هذا البرنامج الذي خص نسخته السابعة خصيصاً للنساء. ثم ننوه بالعمل الذي تقوم به مؤسسة محمد السادس بالمواكبة لهذه الفئة بالخصوص أثناء وبعد الفترة السجنية. في الأخير، أظن أنه حان الوقت للتفكير في إحداث مركز متخصص في نبذ التطرف العنيف يعمل إلى جنب المؤسسات الأمنية، السجنية، القضائية والدينية، ومع مؤسسة محمد السادس، لكي تكون مسؤوليته المصالحة، لكي تكون المصاحبة، التقييم والبحث ودعم السياسات العمومية في مجال تدبير هذه الشريحة، رجالاً كانوا أو نساء. وشكراً.
Thank you very much, Selwa, for this very interesting presentation. In fact, you have discussed the role of women in preventing, managing, and in the resolution of crisis and conflicts, as this role has been highlighted by the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. But the involvement of women, as you have mentioned, does not only take place once the risk has appeared, but women are connectors in society, and the prevention of women joining extremist groups can be seen through 2 different approaches: before the indoctrination, I guess. And this is where you have mentioned the different motives between women and men and what drives them to join terrorist groups. So for men, it is generally due to financial reasons, while for women, it can be due to discrimination, lack of understanding of religious texts, which makes them more exposed to extremist speech, and also sometimes revenge that drives this feeling of joining extremist groups. You have also highlighted the necessity of having a family-centered approach in tackling violent extremism. And here again, you have mentioned the strategy to dealing with women who are returning from terrorist group or extremist groups. You have also mentioned that 99 women so far have returned, while 288 out of the 288 that have joined ISIL. And in here again, there is a necessity to develop an approach, an holistic approach that, from what you say, really takes the education part as one top priority. And here you have mentioned the efforts deployed by Morocco in addressing this issue, especially by developing TV programs and channels to inform on violent extremism and the danger of it, but also the literacy campaigns with the important role of the Morshidin and Morshidat in raising awareness on the danger of extremist narratives and the danger that this poses to society. And last but not least, you have also mentioned one milestone advance, I think, especially on the family code, Mudawanat al-Usra, which actually protects women and provides the family environment with more legal securities to avoid social discriminations that can lead to a violent extremism. Thank you again for for this. And again, one last point that you have mentioned, and I think this is also the vocation of such an institute, is the necessity to have an institute that would accompany all the efforts, not only in the research, and also offering a platform for dialogue on these issues. Thank you very much. And before we move to our next presenter, I'd like just to reassure our guests who are joining us through Zoom, Mr. Fernando Renares, Mr. Thomas Wucht, and Mrs. Jennifer Santiago Oreta. Please, I would like to ask you just to bear with us until we finish this very important discussion, and then we'll be very pleased and honored to have your contribution to this discussion. So if you could just bear with us until we conclude this discussion. Thank you again for your patience. And without further ado, please, Mrs. Mhani Ashur, the floor is yours. Thank you.
أولاً شكراً على القائمين على إنجاح هذا المؤتمر. شكراً الدكتور مصطفى رزرازي على هذه الدعوة الكريمة. إذن موضوع مداخلتي سينصب حول النظر إلى المرأة المتطرفة من منظور قانوني. إذن في خضم الحديث عن المقاتلين الإرهابيين الأجانب العائدين من بؤر التوتر، يبرز دور المرأة الذي يطرح تحديات فريدة في هذا السياق، ويطرح العديد من الإشكالات القانونية. سوف أحاول من خلال هذه المداخلات تسليط الضوء على الإشكالات القانونية التي تطرحها عودة النساء من بؤر التوتر، وإبراز الإطار القانوني الدولي والوطني الذي يحدد هذه الفئة، خصوصاً وأن العديد من المواثيق الدولية ذات صلة بالموضوع تدعو إلى ضرورة مراعاة المنظور الجنساني في محاربة التطرف والإرهاب. إذن هذه الدراسة تحاول الإجابة عن التساؤلات التالية: كيف يرى القانون الدولي مسألة العائدين من بؤر التوتر لا سيما النساء والفتيات؟ ما مدى مراعاة الشريعات الوطنية للمنظور الجنساني في معالجة هذه الظاهرة؟ ما هي وضعيتهم القانونية بعد العودة؟ سوف أتناول هذا الموضوع من خلال نقطتين: أولاً النظر إلى المرأة المتطرفة من منظور القانون الدولي، ثم التشريعات الوطنية. إذن على مستوى القانون الدولي سنركز على القرارات الأممية الصادرة عن مجلس الأمن، خصوصاً القرارات الصادرة حول موضوع المرأة والسلام والأمن، مثل القرار 1325 الذي أصدره مجلس الأمن سنة 2000، الذي يدعو إلى حماية النساء والفتيات من العنف الجندري في أوقات الصراع، والقرار 2242 الصادر سنة 2015. وللإشارة فإن بين القرارين أصدر مجلس الأمن 7 قرارات أخرى، إلى أن القرار الأخير هو مهم جدا لأنه يضع مجموعة من الإجراءات التي تضمن تنفيذ البرامج المتعلقة بأمن المرأة كإشراكها في عمليات تحقيق السلام. وبالرغم من أهمية هذا القرار إلا أنه يفتقر إلى الإشارة لإعادة التأهيل وإعادة الإدماج. طبعا هناك العديد من القرارات الأممية الصادرة بصورة متكررة التي أشارت إلى النساء بصورة متكررة، ولعل أهمها قراري مجلس الأمن صادرين سنة 2017. القرار الأول 2395 والقرار الثاني 2396، حيث أكد من خلالهما مجلس الأمن على الحاجة إلى زيادة الاهتمام بالمرأة، طبعا ولأن أي تدبير قد تتخذه الدول في مواجهة ملف العائدات يجب أن يمتثل لمقتضيات القانون الدولي بما فيها القانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان. فأي تدبير قد تتخذه الدولة من أجل التصدي لهذه الظاهرة قد ينتج عنه انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان كالحق في الحياة والسلامة الجسدية والحق في الحرية والأمن، ويمكن لهذه الانتهاكات أن تعمق التباعد والعزلة والإقصاء وتدفع النساء إلى سلوك طريق التطرف، لأن غالباً هذه الجماعات المتطرفة تستغل هذه الانتهاكات من أجل اعتماد لهجة مضللة وتبرير أعمالها وتجنيد أعضاء جدد بمن فيهم النساء. من بين الانتهاكات التي تحول دون عودة النساء إلى أرض الوطن نذكر انتهاك الحق في اكتساب اسم وجنسية، وهو ما يعرقل العودة إلى الوطن بالنسبة للأطفال الذين لا يتوفرون على وثائق الهوية، وبالتالي فالأمهات أيضا لا يستطيعن العودة. في النقطة الثانية سأشير إلى الدستور المغربي دستور 2011، وسأركز على مدى مراعاة التشريعات الوطنية للمنظور الجنساني سواء في التعامل مع المتطرفين العائدين من بؤر التوتر أو المتابعين في بلدهم في ملف الإرهاب، لا سيما وأن المغرب صادق على العديد من المعاهدات الدولية التي تتعلق مضامينها بالجرائم ضد الإنسانية والإرهاب والتجار بالبشر. إذن على مستوى الدستور المغربي لسنة 2011 أكد المشرع من خلاله على سمو المعاهدات والاتفاقيات الدولية على التشريعات الوطنية فور المصادقة عليها، بل والعمل على ملائمة التشريعات الوطنية مع ما تتطلبه هذه المصادقة. أشار المشرع المغربي إلى هذه النقطة في الدستور وفي التصدير، والتصدير هو جزء لا يتجزأ من الدستور. كما نص على مجموعة من الحقوق والحريات أفرد لها بابا كاملا تحت مسمى الحريات والحقوق الأساسية، والتي تتضمن وفي علاقة بموضوعنا الحق في السلامة الشخصية والجسدية والمعنوية، والحق في قرينة البراءة، والحق في محاكمة عادلة، وتجريم التعذيب والمعاملة اللا إنسانية أو المهينة أو الحاطة بالكرامة الإنسانية. الفصول 21 22 23 من الدستور المغربي. على مستوى التشريعات الوطنية يمكن أن نتحدث عن قانون 0303 المتعلق بمكافحة الإرهاب الذي أصدره المغرب بعد الأحداث التي شهدتها الدار البيضاء في 16 ماي 2003. وبما يتوافق مع المعايير الدولية قام المغرب بوضع تعديلات على هذا القانون. يتعلق الأمر بالقانون 86/14. هذه التعديلات جاءت لتناسب قرار مجلس الأمن 2178 الذي قضى تحت البند السابع من ميثاق الأمم المتحدة بتجريم السفر بنية الالتحاق بجماعات إرهابية أو بنية ارتكاب أعمال إرهابية، وبذلك فإن الفعل المهدد للسلم في العالم يقع تحت طائلة القانون الجنائي المغربي ذي الاهتمام الدولي. بما استدعى كما سبقت الإشارة تعديل القانون الجنائي بما يناسب هذا الوضع، وبالتالي أصبح جرما الالتحاق أو محاولة الالتحاق بتنظيمات إرهابية أو تلقي تدريب أو تكوين من أجل الالتحاق بكيانات أو تنظيمات داخل المملكة أو خارجها حسب الفصل 218 فقرة 1 من القانون الجنائي. إذن فالمقاربة الأمنية المغربية واضحة، ترتكز على معاقبة كل من التحق أو حاول الالتحاق بكيانات أو جماعات إرهابية، والمقاتلين العائدين من بؤر التوتر سيجدون حتما القانون في انتظارهم. بالنسبة للنساء سمحت السلطات المغربية للعائدات بالعودة بعد إجراء التحقيقات اللازمة، وأشير هنا إلى أن هؤلاء النسوة يعني يجب أن يخضعن برامج مكافحة التطرف وإعادة الإدماج، لأنه بالمقابل يشكلن تهديداً إنهن بقين دون تأهيل وتأطير ومراقبة. تبقى الإشارة إلى نقطة مهمة، وهي أن الحل الذي تبناه المغرب في محاكمة العائدين يعني وسجنهم وتستفيد منه حتى بعض الدول الأوروبية التي اختارت سحب الجنسية من هؤلاء، خصوصاً وأن أغلبهم مغاربة يعني حاملي الجنسية مزدوجة، فيتم ترحيلهم إلى المغرب. إذن أخيراً يمكن أن أقول أن عودة المقاتلين الأجانب إلى أوطانهم الأصلية هي أصبحت ظاهرة، ولفهم هذه الظاهرة لابد من استعراض الجدل القائم حولها وتحديات ما بعد العودة وإفرازاتها المحتملة على الدولة في حدودها الجغرافية والوطنية وعلى الأمن الإقليمي. طبعاً من الصعب جمع أدلة تثبت أن هؤلاء المقاتلين حاربوا إلى جانب التنظيمات الإرهابية خصوصاً النساء، لأن هناك من يرى ضرورة معاملتهن كضحايا. ليبقى السؤال المطروح عن مدى قابلية هؤلاء النسوة على الاستجابة للعودة، وشكراً.
Thank you very much, Mahani, for your presentation on extremism and women in violent extremism from a legal perspective. You have cited all the international texts, especially the UN Security Council resolutions. Since the 1325 in 2000, a number of texts has in fact highlighted the role of women in preventing, managing, and in the resolution of crisis, but also it has also highlighted the impact of violence on women and girls. And a number of adjustments, as you have mentioned, was put forward on the National Penal Code, especially to align with the international requirements. And as you have mentioned in your conclusion, the main question is really about the consideration of whether women returnees are to be considered as victim or perpetrator. And this is a question that remains and that is really open to a number of research and discussions. So thank you very much again for your contribution. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Yasmin. Yasmin, the floor is yours.
Just a moment, please, for the presentation to be. Okay. Okay. So, fellow panel, distinguished experts and guests, on the behalf of the Moroccan Observatory on Violence and Extremism, I am very honored to be intervening today at the 5th session of the role of women in violent extremism for a new approach that transcends stereotyping. So you might ask me why I have chosen this title. The explanation will be furthermore given. Women as primary actors in violence extremism towards a new analyzed approach. So before entering into the introduction, I would like first to start by gender in terrorism has been an addressed issue by different scholars and authors in the international security threat of countries. I would like to make sure as well to explain that all of the detailed explanations and detailed research have been conducted and retrieved from my own fieldwork. In fact, we always have that general contextualization that shows that there is a possible correlation between identity crisis and the socio-economic, cultural, and psychological inequalities. And for the profile of women that have been chosen for this study are the single woman, the submissive, the conservative, the one that's always seeking a refuge within the profile men. And I would like to make sure to clarify the fact that we need to differentiate between the literature review that show that women have been shown as primary actors and those who have been shown as secondary actors. The difference is large. For the use of transferability, my research can be definitely applied to any country that is facing the same issues with slums and women relocated slum dwellers. Again, the fieldwork that I have conducted specifically speaks about the new analyzed approach for radicalization factors, and of course, the anatomy of the slum, that is a recent fieldwork that I have conducted by myself as well, to explain the strategical approach of these women relocated slum dwellers. So in terms of the radicalization factors, we have the transnational flows that are leading into the gender progressive discourse. And this gender progressive discourse explains the correlation between the gender and the components of radicalization. Throughout this gender and the components of radicalization, there is that round circle of extremist ideology through which women happen to live on it every day, while the transition from one place to another, from one status to another, and from one environment to another. And we need to keep in mind that. Finally, we have that patriarchal status that is including the feelings of oppression and the feelings of submission through which these women are living, while moving again from one place to another. And again, the specificity of this fieldwork is the fact that these women have been relocated and have been opposed and oppressed by the new subculture they are living through. So here we have the social psychological factors, we can call them the SPs, and the social demographic factors, we can call them the SDs. In terms of the social psychological factors, I have by myself conducted a fieldwork with IDMEJ Association, which is happening to be in the district of Sidi Moumen in Casablanca. And this association had helped to help these underserved and vulnerable teenagers and mothers that have been already indoctrinated. Secondly, we have those strain theories. These strain theories are considered to be a response to any kind of negative treatments. And here the negative treatments is the oppression at the social level, the conditions that are the socio-economic and cultural vulnerabilities, and as well the disparities. And finally, the events that are the transition from one place to another. So these studies have shown as well that violent extremism can be the result of a collective strain that is produced with discrimination and feelings of injustice. Again, there is another fieldwork that I have conducted by myself as well with Mr. Abdelhaq Bassou, a senior fellow at the Policy Center, who was present here yesterday and who have given his own intervention. So during our interview, we have concluded that these women have defensive reactions. In fact, these collective strains on women that have been previously living inside of slums are the reasons why they are easily indoctrinated. So we concluded that radicalization, on the other hand, is the result for their vulnerability. And finally, we have that Oedipal conflict that these women are facing and have been facing since the first day they have been moving from one place to another. In terms of the SDs, or the social demographic factors, we have the intersectionality, which is the state of discrimination that is developed within the socio-economic, cultural, and political disparities, vulnerabilities, privileges that, in my case, give the ability to these women to accept easily extremist offers and to feel prosperous to belong to the upper social class. Thus, we have this combination of the socio-economic, political, and cultural factors that these relocated women slum dwellers fear, avoid, and does not adapt to the change easily. Finally, we have the subcultures that is as well considered as a problematic issue. Why? Because these women, while being relocated from one place to another, have been oppressed and have been subject to live with the other, with the new subcultures, with the new environment, with the new socioeconomic factors. Going back to the Cities Without Slums program that was created for both to eradicate the extremist thoughts and as well to gather all of the social classes, once being transited to the other residential groups, which is, for example, the case of Temsna, women that have been living in the case of Temsna, and I can cite one of them who told me, I am very happy to go back to my previous lives in slums. At least I do not pay taxes. At least I do not pay electricity. So this case study gave us the ability to understand that these women, while the removal and while the transition from one place to another, are easily vulnerable, not because of religion, but because of socioeconomic and cultural and psychological disparities. So for the strategical approach of the anatomy of the slum, we have the positions of each room, the number of inhabitants, the environment and surroundings, the impossibility for these women to cooperate, the gender identity crisis, and the categorization and identification by the others. So in terms of the positions of each room, and throughout the fieldwork I have conducted, if we take into example and into consideration the fact that in a slum there is one room with 4, 5, 6 members of the family living all together in the same room. Next to this room, there is the kitchen, and next to the kitchen, there is the door, and next to the door, it is open to other neighbors. This gives us the ability to understand that all of these people all of these vulnerable communities are living inside of extremists and violence and vulnerabilities, which gives them the ability to have higher chances and increase a higher percentage for them to be easily vulnerable and easily indoctrinated. In terms of the number of inhabitants, it's the same thing. I have conducted my fieldwork with 4 slums. For the same slums, we can find another family with 8, 9, 10 members of the family inside the same slums, which again increases the abilities for these vulnerabilities to happen. Thirdly, we have the environmental surroundings. For the environmental surroundings, it is very simple. It's again the neighbors that are living next to them. So in slums, I have noticed that they are living inside of the same environment. They are living together. They are chit-chatting. They are eating together. Inside of their residential groups, they are away from each other. They are not living next to each other. They are opposed, and to the new culture they have left inside of the slums. Fourthly, we have the impossibility for these women to cooperate with the social categorization and with the other social classes that are the middle social class and the upper social class. Because yes, in the city of Temsna, there is, for the suburban city of Temsna, there are 3 different categorizations. For the gender identity crisis, these women cannot cooperate with their identity crisis, where the identity disparities, and of course with each other. And as it is an ongoing research, I would like to conclude with hypotheses that are, so if women come from slums and their vulnerability in terms of socioeconomic and cultural disparities is highly represented because of their social background, then slums might be the source of their vulnerability. If relocated slum dwellers still prone their previous ways of living inside of slums and want to procreate it inside of residential groups, then slums are to be considered as vulnerable habitat. If the residential groups are sources of vulnerability, then my focus group are endangered. Women who join extremist organizations come from unequal and unjust social boundaries and have been socially deviant, are psychologically unstable and easily influenceable for indoctrination. And finally, these women that come from the social psychological deviance of the society where they live psychologically unstable can be easily sexually abused. What I have retained from this research is the fact that becoming radicalized does not necessarily come from religion, but to upgrade themselves for a better socioeconomic and cultural and psychological areas and conditions that are to be considered to be vulnerable. And of course, if you have any advice and interactions, do not hesitate to contact me at the following address, email, and phone number. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, for sharing with us your, let's say, preliminary conclusions from your ongoing field work, which is very enlightening on understanding, I mean, the environment, the social environment, but also all the socio-psychological, the socio-demographic factors that lead women to engage with violent extremist groups, and that makes them more vulnerable to actually endorse extremist discourse. You have also mentioned the, let's say, the transit from slums to going to social housing, and that in general it makes people more vulnerable to discourse, because in general there is a cultural, social crisis that is that they go through in changing the lifestyle, and probably also engaging with the new environment, and discovering a new environment that makes them more vulnerable to extremist discourse, and exacerbates social exclusion that is actually one feeding ground for extremist discourse. Thank you very much, Yasmin, and I will now give the floor to Selma for her presentation. Sorry, to Maha Ghazi for her presentation, and then it's after you, it's Selma.
مرحبا، معكم مها غازي. بداية أود أن أوجه شكري للدكتور مصطفى الرزرازي على دعمه المتواصل للشباب الباحثين في مجال التطرف العنيف، خاصة الشابات الباحثات. سوف تنصب مداخلتي على إعادة تأهيل النساء المنخرطات في أنشطة التطرف والإرهاب، وهنا أود أن أحدد ماذا أعني بعملية إعادة التأهيل. بعد تفكك التنظيمات الإرهابية انحازت الدول نحو توجهات مختلفة إزاء التعامل مع النساء العائدات والنساء على العموم. فهناك بعض الدول انحازت نحو المحاكمات القانونية ومتابعات والإدانة، أو حتى اتخاذ تدابير مثل السحب الجنسية كما فعلت بريطانيا مثلا مع حالة شميمة بيغو. لكن هناك بعض الدول التي اختارت أن لا تتابع النساء، ومن ثم فهذه الدول قامت بعملية إعادة repatriation، وقامت كذلك باحتضان هؤلاء النساء وإعادة تأهيلهن في برامج خارجة عن المؤسسات السجنية. ومن ثم فهناك سياقات مختلفة لعملية التأهيل، سواء كان كنا للمدانات داخل المؤسسات السجنية أو حتى كانت برامج خارج المؤسسة السجنية. كذلك هناك يختلط الأمر بعملية التأهيل المرافقة لما يسمى بعملية نزع السلاح والتسريح وإعادة الإدماج DDR Disarmament Demobilization and Reintegration. سوف أورد الملاحظة الأولى حول صياغة وتركيب هذه البرامج. منذ أن بدأت في سياق بطبيعة الحال التطرف الديني، منذ أن بدأت في تجارب الشرق الأوسط ومنذ أن بدأت في التجارب الآسيوية، فهي كانت تركز على الذكور تحديداً، على فئة المدانين في قضايا الإرهاب الذكور. في مراحل موالية تم الاتفاق أن هناك نساء، وهؤلاء النساء يعني تتزايد أعدادهن وتتطور وظائفهن وأدوارهن داخل التنظيمات الإرهابية، ومن ثم تم الالتفات إلى هذه الفئة وتم إسقاط هذه البرامج، تم إسقاطها على الإناث بنفس الكيفية، وأحيانا تم تطوير هذه الآليات في التعامل مع النساء حتى تراعي الاعتبارات الجنسانية، لكنها منذ البداية فهي يعني مصممة لتتلائم مع حاجيات الذكور. من جهة ثانية، قد أشار قرار مجلس الأمن 2396 الصادر عام 2017 على أهمية كفالة مشاركة المرأة وأدوارها القيادية في إعداد وتنفيذ ورصد وتقييم الاستراتيجيات الخاصة بهذه البرامج وضمان مشاركتها في التدخلات. وهذا بدوره إشكال في المنطقة العربية، لأنه لا نتوفر أساساً على خبيرات مؤهلات للتعامل مع النساء. لا أريد أن أبالغ، لكن نحن لا نتوفر كذلك على خبراء ذكور مؤهلين يعني القيام بتدخلات سيكولوجية في هذا المجال وإحداث التحول السلوكي والمعرفي. الملاحظة الثانية التي سوف أوردها تتعلق بأنواع التدخلات والعملية التأهيلية نفسها. حسب التجارب الحالية يلاحظ، وبطبيعة الحال هذه إشكالية سوف تناقشها زميلتي سلمى، والتي تتعلق بدور الضحية Victimization. هنا معظم التدخلات مع النساء تقبل الجوانب الأمنية وتركز على الآليات النفسية للتعامل مع الصدمة، التروما والوصم، خاصة بالنسبة للعائدات اللواتي عانين من الزواج القسري والإتجار والاختطاف والعبودية ومحاولات الهرب والتفاوض مع المهربين. ثم ما يسمى بالتحول الفكري والهوياتي والشعور بالمعنى والهدف، التمكين السوسيو-اقتصادي، وكذلك محاولة انخراط أو تفعيل أدوار الأسرة. إلا أنه حسب المنتدى العالمي لمكافحة الإرهاب GCTF، وتحديداً الوثيقة الملحقة بالمرأة ومكافحة التطرف العنيف، فإن هذه القوالب النمطية الجنسانية في الواقع تعيق العمل الأمني. لكن الأمر لا يرتبط فقط بالعوائق الأمنية، وإنما عدم تحديد تقييم المخاطر غير الفعالة للنساء، أو ما يسمى ب Dynamic Risk Assessment. إن لم يتم تحديده بشكل جيد داخل المؤسسات السجنية، فإنه سوف يحدث خللاً في العملية التأهيلية نفسها، لأنها تتحدد بناء على عملية هذا التحديد ليكون على حسب الحالات الفردية. هنا أود أن أشير إلى أن هذه القوالب الجنسانية كذلك التي تتعلق بالأدوار، أن يعني دائما ما يتم اعتبار أن المرأة قد مارست أدوارا ثانوية وأنها لا تشكل خطرا كافيا، ومن ثم هذا في حد ذاته إشكال. في المغرب كانت أكثر عقوبة قدمت للمرأة كانت 6 سنوات بتهم الإعداد، محاولات التخطيط والإعداد إلى غير ذلك. لكن هذا الأمر لا يتعلق بانحياز جنساني بسبب الجنس، وإنما يتعلق بالحالات الفردية التي كانت في التاريخ المغربي فيما يتعلق بالمدانات في قضايا الإرهاب، خاصة أنهن تم استقطابهن إلكترونيا، كنا قاصرات أساسا، تم استقطابهن من وسط عائلي، وهذا أساسا تحدي. وكذلك هذا هناك فرق ما بين أن يكون للشخص بروفايل يعني سيكولوجي إجرامي وأن يرتكب فعل مجرم قانونيا، هناك فرق. ومن ثم ينبغي فهم حوافز الشد والجذب أو push and pull factors وإدراك أنه برغم وجود بعض النقاط المشتركة في دوافع الالتحاق بين الذكر والأنثى، لكن كذلك الأنثى لديها دوافع خاصة، لكن ما يجب التأكيد عليه هنا هو أن هذه الحوافز تختلف من شخص إلى آخر. هي بروسيس فردية، ويجب الاسترشاد بهذه العملية ودراستها بشكل جيد حتى نعرف نمط التدخل المناسب. من جهة ثانية، فإن برامج التأهيل السوسيو-اقتصادية أو ما تحدثت عنه سابقا فيما يتعلق بالتمكين السوسيو-اقتصادي، فهناك أساسا مشكلة تتعلق بأن عندما نمكن النساء اقتصاديا فنحن نوجههن نحو تكوينات ذات أجر منخفض، ولكنها مصممة للنساء يعني بصورة نمطية، كمثلا الكواف، الحلاقة أو الطبخ أو صناعة الحلوى وهذه المسائل والخياطة. كل هذه المسائل هي توسم يعني ليست أولا فعالة من ناحية يعني من ناحية الأجر، لأننا نتحدث عن تمكين، نتحدث عن استقلالية اقتصادية عن الذكر المتطرف، الزوج أو الأخ أو الأب. وما دام هناك لم تكن هناك يعني استقلالية اقتصادية، فليست هناك استقلالية أيديولوجية أو فكرية، هناك تبعية دائما، وهذا يسمى ب عوائق الخروج أو exit barrier، التي دائما ما تجعل المرأة لا زالت يعني لا يفك ارتباطها حتى برغم انتهاء عملية التأهيل. في المغرب مؤسسة محمد السادس لإعادة الإدماج لا تلعب فقط أدوارا يعني تأهيلية من ناحية التمكين الاقتصادي، وإنما كذلك ما يتجاوز ذلك من عوائق قانونية. وبعد مثلا سوف أورد مثال بأن حاليا لدينا في المغرب صفر سجين ضمن قضايا التطرف والإرهاب، وهذا عائد أن هؤلاء النساء تم العفو ملكيا عنهن، وتم انتهاء العقوبة منهن في بعد يعني مصالحة في النسخة الخامسة، وخضعنا لتكوين مع مؤسسة محمد السادس لإعادة الإدماج مع رفقة عائلاتهن بغية يعني التفكير في نمط التأهيل الاقتصادي الذي سوف يكون مستقبلا. هؤلاء النساء ويبلغ عددهن حوالي 10 إلى 13 مرأة. هؤلاء النساء عندما دخلنا إلى المؤسسة السجنية لم يكن قد حصلنا على شهادة البكالوريا، كنا غير متمدرسات وكنا قاصرات لا يزلنا في طور التمدرس. من داخل المؤسسة السجنية بالمغرب حصلنا على شواهد البكالوريا، وحاليا يتابعنا دراستهن الجامعية في تخصصات مهمة في علم النفس وفي تخصص شبه طبي. وهذه نقطة مهمة جدا أن هؤلاء النساء قد كنا حسنات السلوك داخل المؤسسة السجنية، وشاركنا في عمليات تأهيلية وفي الدورات التي كانت مصممة لجميع النزلاء، يعني سجناء الحق العام وسجناء التطرف، وهذه نقطة مهمة جدا. والنقطة الملحوظة الرابعة التي سوف أوردها في هذه المداخلة هي أن إعادة تأهيل النساء المعنيات مرتبطة بجهود حل ملف القاصرين والأطفال العائدين. هناك تمييز بين نوعين من الأطفال الذين التحقوا رفقة أمهاتهم إلى بؤر التوتر، هذه من جهة. هنا كثير من الأمهات تمت معاقبتهن لأنهن قمن بإهمال أطفالهن أو قمن بتعريض أطفالهم للخطر، وهذا بطبيعة الحال يتنافى مع مبادئ حقوق الأطفال. هذا من جهة. وما أريد أن أشير إليه أن هؤلاء النساء كذلك يعانين من وصم اجتماعي فيما يتعلق بهذه النقطة، أنهن أمهات سيئات بين قوسين. النقطة الثانية هي الأطفال الذين ولدوا في بؤر التوتر. هؤلاء يعانون من مشكل أنهم ليس لديهم جنسية وليس لديهم وثائق كافية، ومن ثم فهذا يبقى عائقا حتى بالنسبة لإدماج الأم، لأنه يجب حل هذا الملف. النقطة الخامسة والأخيرة التي سوف أشير إليها في هذه المداخلة تتعلق بأن إعادة تأهيل النساء المعنيات تتكامل مع جهود الوقاية من التطرف. هنا أنا أحدد تصور أكبر وأوسع جدا، وهو الذي يتعلق بbuilding resilience. نحن لسنا في خضم فقط أبعاد مؤسساتية وأبعاد مؤسساتية أو أدوار قانونية مرتبطة بالبرامج التأهيلية، وإنما بما هو أعمق من ذلك، بثقافة التسامح في المجتمع نفسه، بكذلك تصور الذي تبنيه الأمم المتحدة عن المرأة والأمن والسلام، أن النساء كلهن فاعلات داخل المجتمع. وسوف أريد فقط آمالا حول برنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي الذي حاول أن يمول 18 دولة من أفريقيا، والمغرب هو ضمن المجموعة الثالثة ضمن هذه الدول، في برنامج المنع والاستجابة للتطرف العنيف في أفريقيا، والذي يتعلق بالتنمية والتطرف العنيف. وهنا حاول هذا البرنامج أن يقوم بتأهيل الجمعيات وأخصائي الدعم النفسي والاجتماعي والمهني من أجل توعية أو كيفية التعامل مع أشخاص المدانين سابقا في قضية التطرف والإرهاب والنساء العائدات من بؤر التطرف والإرهاب. لكن نحن لا نحتاج فقط إلى هذه المبادرة، وإنما نحتاج إلى جهود مدنية كبيرة. وشكرا.
Thank you very much, Maha, for your presentation. I mean, you have definitely shown how the CVE and PVE programs have moved to from let's say a male-dominated approach to a more female-centered approaches, taking into account the specificities of women joining violent extremist groups, and also looking at gender-responsive policies. You have also highlighted some of the push and pull factors that lead women to engage with violent extremist group, and mostly also psychological vulnerabilities that make them more prone to extremist discourse. And finally, you have insisted on empowering women, and also in looking at all the necessities to financially empower women in order to integrate and to integrate society. You have also highlighted the necessity to tackle issues of child protection, especially with regards to underage women joining terrorist groups, but also with regards to young children growing up with families that are indoctrinated and who are finding themselves in jihadist territories with no protection so far. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. And last but not least, I will now give the floor to Salma Biro. Please go ahead.
Just a moment so the presentation starts. So I would like, first of all, to thank Dr. Razi for inviting us to this panel, and also thank him for his very pointing and supervision through all the process of my research. The project of my presentation is The Victims of Terrorism, a reading in the Moroccan experience. First of all, I want to start my intervention by stating that unlike the terrorism of the 19th century, terrorism today is not as a cyber like the personalities and the political known people as a target. Today, the victims are not the direct target of terrorism. They are people, innocent people. So the victims of terrorism are a very important subject to tackle today. And also, it is very important to state that the last decade and of this century, the issue of the victims of terrorism has become one of the most common issues. It is controversial as it has received ample attention. at the national and international levels. And it is no longer acceptable to focus on the human rights without considering the rights of victims of terrorism today. So the problematic of my presentation will be what is the international sphere and community striving to consider the rights of these victims to reparation, to psychological accompaniment, and is it taking all the strict measures and procedures to confront this transgression and limit while helping victim going through the situation they live in, either it's the victims themselves or their families and relatives. So to tackle this, I will first of all talk about the effort that the international sphere is progressing and evaluating during the last decades, and pointing the weakness of the status of the victims under the international legal system against terrorism, and the strength of the victim status in the within the legal system for fighting crime. Second of all, I will tackle the question of compensation of the victims within a comparative approach, and focusing on the Moroccan case with the treatment of compensation cases of victims of terrorism. And then I will tackle the specificity of the women victims of terrorism and the case of returnees within the conversion about the human traffic law. So international effort to promote the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of terrorism. First of all, the weak status of victims of terrorism in the legal system. The legal system for combating terrorism completely neglected for a long time the issue for support and protection for victims of terrorism acts, and confined itself referring to victims in some of the instruments related to the field of combating terrorism, such as we can find the International Convention for the suppression of the victims and suppression of, for the financing of the terrorism site in New York on January 10 of the year 2000. Also, the International Convention Against Taking Hostages, signed in New York on December 18 of 1979. So these were examples of conventions where the victims were mentioned, but not really tackled as an issue, and there was no measures taken for victims of terrorism themselves officially. But to tackle the strength of the victim status within the legal system for fighting crimes, we can say that in contrast with the neglect of the victims of terrorism in crimes in the international legal system, the UN has acknowledged a specific and special attention to the issue of the victims in general through the adoption of several international texts. And I will mention the protection of the victims by criminalizing, the acts of terrorism. First of all, the international instruments concerning the offenses based on the status of victims, international instruments relating to offenses connected with civil aviation, conventions also relating to offenses related to the hazardous materials, in particular nuclear material, and international instruments relating to the offenses related to the financing of terrorism. And without forgetting the terms of the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 4034, which adopted the basic principles of justice to victims of crimes in general. Also, the Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice of Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power adopted by the United Nations. I will give a specific review on what is the victim of terrorism referring to this declaration. So the victim of terrorism is persons who individually, or collectively have suffered from harm, including physically or morally injury, emotional suffering, material loss, or serious impairment or their fundamental rights through acts committed in violation of criminal law. And the question here is what access to justice for these victims referring to the declaration. They have the right to access to justice and prompt reparation for the harm they have suffered during the attack, the terrorist attack, as provided for a national legislation, and have access to the institution that will provide them with all the help to redress. For the last question and the last review for this declaration.
Maybe you can change your slides as well. Move forward with your slides on the screen.
Oh, no, yeah. So what's compensation? For the compensation referring to the declaration, the states in general are specifically requested to supplement the financial capacity and psychological capacity to the offender with other sources which, such as compensation, cannot provide, for example. Yeah, is it moving? So for the second part, I will tackle the question of compensation of victims of terrorism in the light of the comparative approaches and reading the Moroccan experience. First of all, I would like to mention that the idea of the state is responsible to repairing and compensating the victims of terrorism is a new concept that wasn't addressed before this last decade. And the international practices in the field of the compensation of victims of terrorism events has reflected a multiplicity in dealing with this issue. So each country has a specific way to deal with the issue of compensating. And for some countries, they choose, I will then, yeah. So some systems, there are systems that have established a specific and special legal framework that regulates the issue outside the normal handling of compensation claims before the judiciary. Others that were limited to developing a temporary friendly solution to provide redress for the victims of terrorist attacks. And third ones are the systems that were satisfied with opening the way for those affected to resort to the court to claim compensation within the framework of the general rules. So for the Moroccan case, there were three main cases in Morocco that were addressed by two ways, either judicial system or non-judicial system. And within this, I will give three examples that are judicial treatments by Atlas Asni terrorist attack that were in Marrakesh 1994, Argana terrorist attack that were in Marrakesh 2011, and the non-judicial treatment is the terrorist attack of the 16th of May in Casablanca. As for the Atlas Asni terrorist attack, the administration court in Rabat has issued its ruling to respond to the request of the families and relatives of the victims. In a specific case, there was the family of a victim, a Spanish victim, that was requesting compensation alongside with the Moroccan judicial system. So the Moroccan administration court in Rabat issued its ruling to respond to this request for compensation on the ground of that the attack did not target the person itself, but rather the security and stability of the state, which is the burden of responding to such serious attacks, and the court considered that the state is responsible to protect its borders and considered that the state failure to monitor its borders and the entry weapon that were used in the aforementioned attack is an accompanying mistake of the state for which the state and along bears responsibility. Judgment number 911 of November 9, 2001 in the administration file. For the second case, which is the Argana case, the administrative chamber, while aligning itself with the position of the Rabat court, considered that the responsibility of the state, while ruling out the existence of fault, the final decision was compensation based on the principle of national solidarity and the socialization of the risk. As for the non-judicial treatment, referring to the Dahir number 103-178 of September 11, 2003, the state provisionally allocated an arbitrary compensation financial grant from its general budget for the benefit of the beneficiaries and of the victims of the terrorist attack that happened in the 16th of May in Casablanca. So as for the third part of my intervention, I would like to tackle the specificity of the victims that are women in Morocco. And I will first of all tackle the specific treatment of the returnees, women returnees and minor returnees in Morocco. So I would like first of all to mention that the victims are not a homogeneous group. They each one have their needs and expectations and priorities. Some will demand the truth, and this would be enough for them. Others would demand compensation, and other groups would only want to have some psychological accompaniment after the events. So I guess that the states will need to implement a multi-dimensional and integrated approach to consider the rights of the victims in the criminal judicial system. So among the exceptional cases were the women who over the time have been a potential victim of the jihadist ideology and terrorism in general. So terrorist groups such as Daesh in Syria and Iraq, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab are showing themselves more and more creative in the ways that they're torturing, destroying lives of women. Several women have been kidnapped, raped, tortured, and killed in the most cruel ways. And the Sham Harouche case in Morocco is the ultimate proof of this. So in Iraq, between 2030 and 2015, around 14,000 women were killed by the Daesh group, and several more were committed suicide due to the lack of security and dignity. Not to mention the scale of sexual harassment and sexual violence by terrorists for political and military purposes. So because of this, and since criminalizing the act of terrorism in the basic technique of protecting victims advocate the values of a moderate Islam and embody the values of equality, toleration and peace. In our education system, and criminalizing all kinds of violence against women is a must for all the countries, including Morocco. The issue of the victimization of women from the coming back from the areas of tension is a question that has raised many discussions since 2015, let's say. with references to the Security Council Committee created by the resolution of 2001-1373 on the subject of the fight against terrorism, which does not specify the fate of foreign fighters coming back from the large part of terrorist groups in Iraq and Syria. In this sense, the issue of women and minor returning from these areas has left the international community confused about how to tackle and how to treat this issue. So the question of victimization referring to the conditions of the existence of a case of human trafficking to take place, given that in an Arab Muslim country, the context of women, she can find herself always under pressure for a man or a relative, also according to the mentioned testimonies in the reports. So most of the women did not realize that there were, what were their destinations or what were their roles in the new community they are leaving their countries for. This, and therefore the dictates not to prosecute these women and minors, but security constraints remain present for the freedom and for the returnees from the tension, from the zones of tension. Sorry. So Morocco has chosen to base itself on the intelligence surveys to be able to distinguish between the people who left for the fight and others who played the role of accompanying their husbands and relatives in general, and prepared a strategy based on a specific treatment for each case from the returnees women and also the minors. So which we can suggest a welcoming for with a psychological help and social support, and helping them to reintegrate the society without furthermore prosecution. And in my third point and last one, I would like to tackle the point where the convergence between the law of human trafficking and terrorism comes. So I will allocate space for the legislative framework to combat human trafficking as it relates to Law 2714 of the year 2016, which is concerned by changing and completing the provisions of the criminal law and the criminal procedural law. For the Article 448.1 of Law 2714 defines the concept of human trafficking, which it intends, the request, lure, transfer, harbor, receive, or mediate a person by means of treatment or use of force or use of various forms of coercion, kidnapping, fraud, and or deception. Exploitation of includes all forms of sexual deception. Exploitation also of a person to carry a criminal act or an armed conflict in general. So through this definition, we find that the legislator added a new form of exploitation represented in the exploitation of pornography by means of communication and information communication, or exploitation of a person to carry out a criminal act or an armed conflict. And this is...
Selma, please, if you may conclude.
Yeah, this is my last... yeah. And this last image of exploitation pictures specifically constitute a legal reference to adapt a legal statute of Morocco women who proceeds from hotspots of stress. So in order to reinforce this proposal, it remains to refer in the end of the resolution 2331 issued by the Security Council, in which it represented concrete acts of terrorism and human trafficking through, first of all, the fact that sexual exploitation, forced marriage, and slavery have become part of the strategic goals and ideology thinking in which the terrorist groups believe. And second, human trafficking, especially in the case of girls, is still a very important component of the financial flows received by some terrorist groups. But however, this question of victimization remain an unresolved for several countries, including Morocco and institutions. So the subject is still open for discussions and also field research as well that we all recommend countries to work on for this next years. Maybe we can find a common ground to tackle the question of the returnees, which is a very sensitive security issue for all of us. And thank you. And sorry for the time.
Right, it was actually very interesting, Selma. Thank you very much for your presentation and for looking at women in violent extremism from a victim's perspective. You have, in fact, cited the UN Security Council texts that actually put forward the principle of justice for victims by ensuring compensation, also not neglecting the psychological aspects and providing the needed psychological support, for which I'm sure Dr. Rizrazi has very extensive experience with dealing with this side of providing some sort of justice to the victims and the people involved with groups, with the extremist groups. But you have also mentioned a third need, which is the need to reach the truth. And I think this would also be important for victims to move forward and reach some sort of redemption after being victim of terrorist groups. And I would like to thank you for all the cases that you have introduced where at the national levels, aspects were handled through a judiciary approach, and also why choosing a non-judiciary way as well. And last but not least, which you have highlighted, is looking at victims of terrorists and the link with human trafficking, for which, especially for women, serves as incentives for terrorist groups and for recruiting terrorists to join some groups. Is also human trafficking, where women are mostly the victims. And this has been highlighted also by the UN Security Council 2331, as you have said. So thank you very much for your very extensive presentation. And I think before we move to the debate, I would like to invite our guests who have been kindly waiting for us to have this discussion. And I hope you have been still holding with us. So Mrs. Jennifer, I hope your sound is active, and I hope we can connect with you now. So maybe let's try for another test.
Hello, can you
Yes,
hear me?
Mrs. Jennifer.
Can you hear me now? Okay, fine. Very good. All right. I apologize for not being able to join you yesterday, and thank you very much for the invitation for today. What I will try to do is to present to you in probably 10 to 12 minutes the experience of the Philippines, particularly in reintegration. And if I can just share my screen. All right, so this is the case of the Philippines. Basically, the number of armed groups, no, or what we call the internal armed groups in the country, can be clustered into four general themes. No? So you have the armed rebel groups, you have the terror organizations, private armed groups of politicians and political families, as well as the criminal syndicates. I'm not going to cover all of them. I will just focus very generally on the armed rebel groups as well as the terror organization. You'll notice that under the armed rebel groups, it is further subdivided into two no, the separatists, no, those who the organizations that wanted to secede from the Philippine state, and the communists, no, those who want to replace the Philippine government with a socialist type of system. And then, of course, you have the terror organization. Again, I'm not going to discuss them, but I just want to show you that you have a list here, and this is not a comprehensive list. No, I only placed here six existing organization, but there are a lot of other organization that are splintered, no, from the main organization. No, I mentioned or I included the private armed groups and the criminal syndicates because in certain localities or geographical location, there is really a collaboration or tactical alliance between either an armed rebel group or the private army or a criminal syndicate. No, so the gray area that allows these internal armed groups, no, to traverse actually is very large. No, and to further elaborate, I will show you a map later. No, but this is the actions of the state. No, when it comes to the internal armed groups. No, again, it can be divided into two general interventions. No, the first is the peace talks. No, so right now the Philippine government is in peace negotiation to reach a political settlement with Moro National Liberation Front, Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and the Communist Party. Of these three organizations, a peace agreement has already been reached with the Moro National Liberation Front or MNLF and Moro Islamic Liberation Front. So it's only the Communist Party that the government is still trying to find a political settlement with. No, the next intervention of the state would be military action. So terror organization, criminal organization, these all are dealt with by the state using focused military operations. This is the map that I was mentioning earlier. No, so again, for the discussion today, I will just look into the rebel organizations and to some extent the terrorist organization. You'll notice that in the map, no, and I borrowed this from the military. No, this is a 2011 map. No, the darker is the shade of the red. That means the higher is the intensity of armed encounter between the government forces and the rebel internal threat group, no, whether that is the secessionist or the communist or the terror organization. So not all of the country actually is affected by the presence of armed rebel groups. No, but what I want to point out here is that the operational battle space, no, of internal armed groups are actually very fluid. No, so you have organizations that are secessionist but also terrorist, for example, in some area. In the circle area, in the area here, for example, in the island provinces. No, I hope that you can see the ASG and the MNLF. No, this is the island provinces of Sulu, Basilan, and Tawi-Tawi. No, this is the backdoor channel that is being used by foreign terrorist fighters to enter the country. No, because this is the one that that is nearest. No, these island provinces are the ones nearest Malaysia and Indonesia. No, so this area is in a sense the backdoor channel that is being used by foreign terrorist fighters to enter the Philippines or to enter Indonesia also and Malaysia. So the operational space of these organizations really very fluid, and therefore the intersection of criminal organization and criminal activities, no, and terror activities is really a challenging situation, especially for the security forces. So this is the context, no, of the reintegration program that I want to discuss. No, so the reintegration program of the Philippines actually is somehow reframed. No, you'll notice that in the international parlance, it is called DDR. No, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. But in the context of the Philippines, there is a slight modification with the terminologies that we use. No, for example, instead of the word disarmament, we are using arms control and management. Why? Because in the country, civilians are actually allowed procure no or purchase firearms no for their own protection no and subject to the requirements no satisfying the requirements of the government, they can actually have a license for it no. So arms control, demobilization, and the reintegration program is actually called rebuilding and rehabilitation, and the intention really is to contribute to the security stability of communities, as well as improve the quality of life of former rebels. Now let's focus now on the normalization or the reintegration program. No, again, the reintegration program somehow is reframed. No, we call it normalization. No, why? Because the argument here is that the the internal armed threat groups no or the rebel organizations are actually embedded in communities no, they have not and therefore the terminology reintegration actually is not accurate no, because they are already in the community no, they are embedded deeply in the different communities. So what we want to do actually is to normalize no the situation, move away from the use of violence no to address or to advance a political agenda, and return to a civilian no civilian way of life no. That's why we are using the term normalization no. So they are assisted to rebuild and improve the quality of their lives no, as well as their family and community are also assisted so that they can return back no to a civilian no civilian context. Now our reintegration is divided actually into two no, the reintegration that is based on a peace agreement. Now this is an example of a reintegration based on a peace agreement no. Again, I'm not going to go through the details. I just want to show you that the normalization and the reintegration program is intimately tied with the political milestones no. So in other words, for example, here you will see decommissioning of arms and forces and socio-economic package no. It is closely tied with the political milestone. In other words, the decommissioning here will not happen without the political milestone no. So the reintegration framework no in the context of organizations with peace agreement already with the government is really closely connected no with the political agenda and the political agreement between the government and the rebel organization no. On the other hand, we also have a reintegration program where with members of organization where we don't have yet a peace agreement no. So in a sense, the first one we can call it a reintegration based on group no. This one is reintegration for individual no individual members no. This is really meant for as I've said, members of organization where the government still has no peace agreement. So like the communist organization, as well as the members of the terrorist organization no. So you'll notice here that the objective really is, again no, the orange box here no is really the goal no of the program no, for the former rebels or the FRs no and their families no to be productive members of society. And at the same time, the program also wants to ensure that the local government units no because the local government units is supposed to be in the front line in the implementation of a lot of these programs no. So the local government units and relevant national government agencies are capacitated no to address the needs no of the former rebels or the returning or the surrendering rebels no. So the component of the program is on security, socio-political rights no. Some of them have pending cases no. The demilitarization of the firearms that they're going to surrender, economic mainstreaming, social protection packages, health education program for the individual, and healing and reconciliation with their family and the community no. And as I've said no, with regard the gray box here, no, with regard the strengthening of the local government units, no, so that they can be more capable in addressing the problem of reintegration. There is also an ongoing program, no, to address this issue. All right. So the goal of the DDR, no, and the reintegration, more in particular, as I have mentioned earlier, is to contribute in the community security, stability, and resilience. No. Now take note that I keep on emphasizing that the DDR really is community centered. No, it's really community centered. No. So at the same time that we recognize the need for individuals who are surrendering, it's still within the context of the community, no, or the program that is implemented to assist them is still within the context of their family and their community, no. So it is community based, no, and individual centered at the same time, no. So the long-term goal of the DDR is to ensure that violence will not return anymore in the exercise of politics, no. So in the case of the reintegration program, based on political agreement, as well as the reintegration for individuals, no, surrendering, the focus, again, in the case of the Philippines, the focus of the program is really disengagement, no, meaning we are, or all the programs of the government is really meant to convince, no, and assist the members to refrain from the use of violence, no, to refrain from the use of violence, no. But this is the weakness of our reintegration program, no. The deradicalization actually is the challenge, no. So the reintegration, our reintegration program is very strong on the disengagement framing, but the deradicalization actually is actually a challenge, no. We are weak in terms of the deradicalization. So this is my final slide, no. So and I'm just going to go through them very quickly, no. If the program of the government for the former rebels and their communities is perceived to be insufficient, no, or if the fuels of violence, no, are not addressed, there is always the temptation to return to rebellion, no. Take note that the DDR is only being carried out with groups where with political agreement with the government, but there are still a lot of organizations on the ground, no. That's why I showed you the map earlier. There's still a lot of organization, internal armed groups, no, on the ground that are still being dealt with by the government. So if the intervention of the government is not sufficient, then they can always there's always the temptation to return and go back to rebellion, no. A major safeguard, however, in order for this not to happen, is to have a very strong re-civilianization, no, in the communities affected by conflict, no. But again, no, this is also a big challenge because a lot of these communities are also poverty stricken and geographically isolated, no. So it takes the intervention of the government will take a while, no, for in order to address the issue of poverty and the issue of access, no. The gender lens, no, and the mainstreaming of concerns of vulnerable groups are still framed, no. Presentation earlier, no. They are both the victim centeredness, no, framing is still very strong, no, and the approach is to accommodate the vulnerable sectors and the gender or the women, no, instead of recognizing them as a sector that has a full capacity to contribute in peace building. So I end my presentation here, and thank you very much for your attention.
This is Jennifer, and just for our viewers, I'd like to just remind that Mrs. Jennifer's presentation was complementary to yesterday's discussion on disengagement, de-radicalization, and rehabilitation tools, approaches, and assessment methods. So without further ado, I'd like to also call Mr. Fernando Renares, who is Director of the Violence, Radicalization and Global Terrorism Program at the Elcano Institute in Spain. Mr. Fernando, are you with us? Are you connected with us? Yes, yes, Mr. Fernando, the floor is yours. You can, you could then mute yourself and go ahead. Mr. Fernando, not sure if you can hear us, or maybe we can call Mr. Thomas Wust, who is Executive Secretary General of the International Institute for Justice and Law in Malta.
Okay, I'm unmuted, and I think you can see me. Okay, I hope that's not my feedback loop. No. Okay, great. First of all, I apologize that I had some technical difficulties yesterday and I wasn't able to join my session, but I'm very honored to be here today on behalf of the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law. I would just like to say at the outset, thank you to the organizers for this excellent event and your agenda, which I have followed and looked at very closely. As some of you may know, Morocco is a member of our governing board of administrators, and we're really pleased to be here today. I'd like to say that these remarks are largely in my own personal capacity, drawing from my experience in preventing and countering violent extremism, and I would ask that they're considered under Chatham House rules as appropriate when we proceed with the remarks. That said, I would like to just first of all say the IIJ is located in Valletta, Malta. We are a global counterterrorism forum inspired institution focused on criminal justice practitioners, primarily in Africa and the Middle East. And of course, as I noted at the beginning, Morocco is a trusted partner. So I looked at your agenda and the session that I was scheduled to speak on, and I would just like to share some reflections as where I see the state of play in radicalization, and particularly this was to talk about the trends, technology, and hate speech and such items, which are really topical right now. So without further ado, and then if I go too long, just tell me. I'm happy to shorten as it gets down to the end, but I have quite a bit of thoughts put together. So first of all, I don't want to belabor the point. I see that the pandemic, which we're now almost at a year, poses an opportunity for a renewal and resurgence of a lot of multilateral structures and re-engagement for international collaboration. To be honest, as an institution, the IIJ, we are a year into this pandemic stronger in many ways because we've learned a lot of things ourselves about using this online space to improve the capacity building and the dialogue that we're doing with partners around the world. So I think that's a positive that we will take away from this, despite the tremendous challenges that we've had over the last year. And what you're doing today is inspiring to me, because we are also looking at hybrid type meetings where some people are in a physical room participating and other people are dialing in as we sort of edge out of this horrible pandemic. Now, over the years, we've come to understand that radicalization in many cases is an individual process. It is hard to understand the motivations and hard to understand what could be done differently by the state, by communities, by family members, peers, And it may not be very far from the truth saying that every radicalization case may need a tailor-made solution. Further, if you think about where we are in 2021 today, the current state of violent extremism worldwide includes the wave of ISIS-inspired attacks, which began to spread rapidly in the mid-2010s, and lately the consequent far-right politics and violent extremist attacks. The ISIS-inspired attacks peaked between 2015 and 2017. Nevertheless, isolated attacks continue to threaten global security, and preventing and countering violent extremism remains critical according to Europol's Terrorism Situation and Trend Report 2020. But it's crucial also to prepare not only for traditional inspired attacks, but this far-right violent extremism conducive to terrorism as a rising threat that will play a central role. Well, governments have historically pursued their efforts against white supremacists and other hate groups through non-CT avenues and not as counterterrorism per se. The community of PCV practitioners, of which many of us on this call are at, have really gained significant experience in counterterrorism through addressing the threat posed by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates. While some of this experience and expertise is directly relevant to countering far-right extremism, there are also significant differences that require new tools, knowledge, and approaches. And while some of these efforts are still in very early stages, there are practical examples from which we can draw lessons and to formulate good practices and approaches that can be replicated in other relations. Another area that I think is related to this that bears mentioning, that the phenomena of foreign terrorist fighters is not new. However, it took on significance and magnitude over the past several years. And it touches on a number of counterterrorism issues that the international community has sought to address. And I listened to some of the speakers earlier today. There's an ongoing call for active regional contributors to these efforts through promoting policy dialogue, exchange of experiences, and capacity building, such as this meeting today. The responses in addressing foreign terrorist fighters require a long-term, comprehensive, and multi-stakeholder approach. I would just emphasize from a perspective of someone that's been involved in this for over 10 years now, I think we have to consider it in the long-term aspect. Quick solutions are not easy, and you have to sort of orient your effort against this on a very long horizon. Sometimes the horizon runs against other budgetary and resource requirements. So it's good that we continue having this dialogue, such as this meeting today. It requires action on many fronts, and the status in 2021 only is making it even more challenging as we go forward. It requires action on the local, national, regional, and international level. Our partners here in our organization have unfortunately had a long experience in combating terrorism, but they've been able to mature their policies, learning from their successes, and sometimes our central role remains to be a regional platform for dialogue and to promote the exchange of peer-to-peer experience. And I would underscore the philosophy from where we come from is peer-to-peer experience. If you've been involved in this work for over 10 years, we've really evolved beyond the capacity building of delivering, of training, one person talking to the other, but really it's a peer-to-peer exchange. And I see the meeting you're doing today is a really great example of this. Now, our work embodies policy precepts, and I think it just bears mentioning relating to the issue of far right, left-wing extremism is upholding human rights and the rule of law at all times. Because in the end, human rights violations feed terrorism. They validate violent extremist propaganda. And to work collaboratively, recognizing the role, expertise, and resources of different actors is really important. We should bear in mind as we think about this issue of these freedoms, a number of human rights are considered absolute and cannot be restricted for any reason, such as the principle of equality or the prohibition of torture. This being said, Internal human rights law itself allows for responses that are committed only if they are justified on legitimate grounds, necessary, proportionate, and applied in a non-discriminatory manner. This is really the essence of a lot of the work that we do in a rule of law fashion. Laws to criminalize incitement to commit acts of terrorism have been called upon as long ago as Resolution 1624 by the UN Security Council, which was adopted in 2005. I know we all don't have our UN resolution numbers memorized, but it just shows you how long this dialogue has been going on. And the Council of Europe has produced a convention defining the criminal offense of public provocation to commit a terrorist offense. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism has endorsed this definition as a good practice, and it was transposed in certain legislations. Again, I would underscore the word proportionate. In order to safeguard these freedoms, the threshold to criminalize speech should be very high, and there will be instances where individuals and groups skillfully walk a fine line to avoid prosecution. But it does not mean nothing else than repression can be done. Speeches that condone terrorism should be deconstructed, contested, challenged through counter narratives, alternative narratives, and symbols that are being used incorrectly should be reclaimed. In many ways, law enforcement would have a secondary role to other stakeholders such as community organizers, human rights organizations, youth workers, social workers, teachers, or even parents. Having a calibrated individual approach is especially crucial when dealing with vulnerable youth, of which many of these cases involved. And to the end of my presentation, I would just like to talk about the role of technology. Technology is playing its part in both regards. Terrorist organizations are taking advantage of technology. Members of these organizations know how to encrypt their messages, surf the web, and it's very anonymous, and secure communication create an own and different protocol system. Technology is also playing its part when countering terrorist activity. One can, for example, use the internet to counter the appeal for violent radicalization and create just such counter narratives. In fact, we are working on a project right now that's looking at multi-stakeholder interagency cooperation and how we can unpack some of these challenges. And finally, what is the role of business in fighting against terror? Business play an ever more important role in fighting terror, especially in the cases where their infrastructure is targeted or exploited to carry out terrorist examples. I would underscore in my remarks the importance of public-private partnerships are really essential to combat terrorist use of the internet. And finally, in closing, how important is collaboration in the war on terror and our collective efforts together as we also encounter new threats such as right-wing extremism? Support and interaction among states, the public and the private sector, as well as international, is really paramount. Meetings such as this show that we all have a stake in it, and your voices are joined with ours here in collaboration and cooperation. And I dearly thank all of you for the time and the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. And I do join you to really encourage such initiatives to share knowledge and also the lessons learned in PVE and CV approaches. I also I join you in saying that it is a very important initiative. So without further ado, maybe we'll see if Mr. Fernando is also available and ready to speak. So we can probably move to the debate after this. Yes, Mr. Fernando? No, he's not. So, I think now we can wrap up this session. I think the session is now closed, and We will reconnect shortly for the debate. Yes? Go ahead. Okay, so thank you. We will go for a 15-minute break and we will get back to you after this. Thank you very much.